Most people think inflation is simple. Prices go up, groceries become more expensive, rent increases, gas costs more, and over time, the money in your pocket buys less than it used to. That explanation is not wrong, but it is incomplete. Because inflation is not just about rising prices, it is also about how wealth quietly moves through the financial system. And once you understand how that movement works, inflation stops looking like a random economic problem. Instead, it begins to look like a structural feature of the modern monetary system. To understand why, you first need to understand what inflation actually represents. At its core, inflation means one thing. There is more money circulating in the economy relative to the amount of real goods and services available. When the supply of money increases faster than the supply of things people can buy, each individual unit of money loses purchasing power. In other words, money becomes slightly less valuable. This process usually happens gradually, sometimes slowly enough that it is difficult to notice from one year to the next. But over longer periods of time, the effects become clear. A house that once cost $100,000 may eventually cost $500,000. A weekly grocery bill that used to be $50 becomes $200. And a salary that once felt comfortable begins to feel stretched. But here is where the story becomes more interesting. When new money enters the economy, it does not appear everywhere at the same time. It enters through specific channels, usually through banks, financial institutions, government spending, and credit expansion. In other words, the money supply grows from certain points within the system before it spreads outward. This creates something economists sometimes call the first receiver advantage. Those closest to the source of newly created money gain access to it before the rest of the economy adjusts. At that moment, the new money still has its full purchasing power. It can buy assets, investments, and property before prices rise. But as that money moves through the system, something begins to happen. Prices gradually start to increase. The same house becomes more expensive. The same services cost more. And everyday goods slowly rise in price. By the time that money reaches the broader population through wages and everyday transactions, much of the economy has already adjusted. This delay is subtle. Most people never notice it happening. But over long periods of time, it creates a powerful redistribution of purchasing power. Those who receive the money early can convert it into assets while prices are still relatively low. Those who receive it later must operate in an environment where many prices have already risen. This difference may seem small in the short term, but when repeated year after year, it becomes significant. Now consider how this interacts with assets. Assets are things that tend to grow in value or produce income over time. Examples include businesses, stocks, real estate, farmland, and productive investments. When the money supply expands, these assets often increase in price. Part of that increase reflects genuine economic growth. But part of it is also the result of more money entering the financial system, more money competing to acquire the same limited assets. This pushes asset prices upward. For someone who already owns those assets, this looks like wealth creation. Their portfolio grows, their property increases in value, their investments appreciate. But in many cases, what is actually happening is a combination of two forces. The asset may be growing in real value, but the currency used to measure that value may also be slowly losing purchasing power. In other words, Some of the apparent wealth increase comes from the asset itself, and some comes from the gradual decline in the value of money. Now think about someone who does not own many assets, someone who primarily earns income through wages and stores their savings in cash. For this person, inflation works differently. Their income may increase over time, but usually not at the same pace as asset prices, and the money they save gradually loses purchasing power. $10,000 saved today may buy significantly less 10 years from now, even though the number itself has not changed. This creates a widening gap between two groups of people, those who own assets and those who depend mainly on income. Over decades, this difference compounds. Asset prices rise, investment portfolios expand, and wealth becomes increasingly concentrated among those who already own productive resources. But there is another powerful force that interacts with inflation: debt. Debt behaves in a very interesting way when the value of money is slowly declining. Because most debt contracts are fixed in nominal terms. If someone borrows a certain amount of money today, the number they must repay usually does not change. But if inflation occurs over time, the purchasing power of the money used to repay that debt declines. In practical terms, the borrower ends up repaying the loan with money that is worth less than when it was originally borrowed. This means moderate inflation can quietly benefit borrowers, especially those who borrow to acquire assets. For example, imagine someone purchasing property with a long-term mortgage. Over time, inflation may increase the value of that property. Meanwhile, the monthly mortgage payment remains relatively stable. The asset grows in value, but the debt remains fixed. And because the value of money declines over time, the real burden of that debt gradually shrinks. This dynamic can create substantial long-term wealth for those who use debt strategically. But the key detail is how the borrowed money is used. Debt used to acquire productive assets can create leverage. Debt used for consumption often creates the opposite result. A loan used to buy depreciating items does not generate income or long-term value, and the borrower is left with liabilities without assets. So the same economic environment can produce very different financial outcomes depending on how individuals interact with it. This is one of the reasons inflation often feels confusing or unfair, because the same force that erodes purchasing power can simultaneously increase asset values. It rewards ownership, it rewards investment, and it tends to penalize idle cash and stagnant income. But it is important to understand that inflation is not always the result of a single deliberate decision. It often emerges from the structure of modern economies. Governments borrow to finance spending. Banks expand credit through lending. Central banks adjust interest rates and liquidity to stabilize economic cycles. All of these forces interact continuously, and together they create a financial system where the money supply tends to expand gradually over time. That expansion creates inflationary pressure, sometimes mild, sometimes more intense, but rarely absent for long. Once you understand this dynamic, the concept of wealth begins to look different, because long-term financial stability becomes less about simply earning money, and more about how that money is positioned within the economic system, whether it sits passively as currency, or whether it participates in assets that grow alongside the expanding money supply. Those who understand this distinction early often make different financial decisions. They prioritize ownership. They seek assets that can appreciate over time. They build investments that generate income, and they become less dependent on cash alone as a store of value. This does not eliminate risk. All investments involve uncertainty, but it aligns financial strategy with the structural reality of the modern monetary system. And that alignment can make an enormous difference over decades. Because in a system where the supply of money gradually expands year after year, the key question is not simply how much money someone earns. The deeper question is how that money interacts with the forces shaping the financial system. Whether it remains static, or whether it grows alongside the economic structures that expand with time. And that distinction often determines who benefits from inflation and who quietly falls behind. Most people experience inflation as rising prices, but inflation is only one part of a much larger system. Behind the scenes, central banks constantly adjust interest rates, liquidity, and financial conditions to influence how money moves through the economy. These decisions shape everything from borrowing costs and housing prices to investment markets and economic growth. And understanding how those decisions are made reveals another layer of the financial system that most people never see. Because while commercial banks create money through lending, something else determines how easy or difficult that lending becomes. And that force sits at the very center of the global financial system. In the next episode, we'll break down how central banks, especially the Federal Reserve, actually influence the entire economy through interest rates and monetary policy. Because once you understand how that system works, you begin to see why economic cycles happen and why markets move the way they do.